Hi, I'm Brad Hodge, and I want to have a quick chat with you today about feedback, giving students feedback. But that's the easy bit really, isn't it? It's actually getting them to do anything about it. It's how on earth do we give students feedback on the way that they write and actually get them to change what they do. And there's a few principles that I've used in the higher education setting and that I've had other staff use in the higher education setting that can make a real difference. You have to remember that it's only when a student does something differently in the future that the feedback made any difference at all. And that's really important. What we're trying to do is to change what students do. Okay, absolutely important. So there's a couple of principles underlying this that we need to remember. Remember way back to when you were a nervy first year student and someone gave you feedback and you were offended and hurt. Didn't want to open it, didn't want to look at it. Getting feedback is really, really difficult. And as academics, as teachers, we can often forget that when someone provides us feedback about something that we don't feel comfortable with, it's actually emotionally really challenging to deal with. This is why students will tell us that, I saw the mark and I'm like, I don't want to look at the feedback, and they just close it. And from our perspective, that looks ridiculous and it's kind of annoying, but as a student, it's really difficult to take that feedback on. So we need to remember that because it affects the way that we provide the feedback. This is a difficult pill to swallow. Sometimes we make the assumption that our students are not trying very hard, when in actual fact they are. Now, regardless of whether that's true or not, when you assume that your students are not trying hard or assume that your students are stupid, none of you would do that, but when you assume these things, your attitude tends to leak in your feedback comments, and it comes through. So when you're providing feedback, it's really, really important to make a note to yourself, I'm going to assume in everything that I'm writing and everything that I'm reading that this student has tried really, really, really hard, even if they haven't achieved the objectives that you were hoping for them. Believe that. And sometimes you have to choose to believe that, but believe that and it will have an impact, a positive impact on outcomes for your students. As I alluded to before, what you're aiming for is a change in behaviour, a change in what the student does, not necessarily a change in what they know. When you give feedback, if you list 50 things that they need to change, at one level you're going to overwhelm them. Yes, you will have given them an enormous amount of useful detail, but the reality is they're not going to remember all of those things. So if they don't remember them, if nothing sticks, they're not going to change the way they do things in the next assessment task. So when you're providing feedback, and I'm thinking specifically with digital feedback tools like Turnitin is the tool that we use here. Now, there are two different ways of providing feedback. One is within text and another is in the comments at the end. Now, both of these are really important, but the way that I would recommend is to use them differently. So for the in-text feedback, what I would do is I would stick to the detail level feedback that's related specifically to this assignment, specifically to this piece of writing. So it's things like grammar and punctuation and use of language, professional use of language, formatting, all of those kinds of things. So just include those kinds of feedback in that document, because these are things that are specific to this document that the student is not necessarily going to implement into their next assessment. And what you need to do is to identify the first couple of times that a student makes each type of mistake. It's not useful for you to identify and circle every single spot where there's a comma that there shouldn't be. You just need to circle the first couple and then make a note and say, commas might be something that you want to work on. Okay? Identify the first couple, then after that, just ignore them. It's not useful to tell the student again and again and again that they've got all of this stuff. Unless they're going to edit it and resubmit it, and then it's a different story. You might want to approach it differently. But you just want to identify the first 2 or 3 moments that a student makes a formatting error, a grammatical error, or something like that, or a particular type of grammatical error, and then move on. Find something else. You've already identified that grammar is a problem. Find something else for them to work on. Now, the most important, I would argue, the most important feedback that you can give your student is the feedback that applies to the next assessment. So this is the feedback that you put in the comments section on the side, and it's things that lessons that this student can take away and apply to whatever they're doing next. Now, you might know within the context of the subject that you're teaching exactly what they're going to be next, and so you can write them really specifically towards that next assignment, or it might be more broadly. It might be about their writing or critical thinking skills. But these comments need to be written to a behavior that you're chasing in the future. What's the thing that you think is most important for this student to work on? It's not about everything. We're not listing the 50 things because we know it takes 3 years to get through a degree. They're going to learn lots of skills. It's just you using your critical thinking skills, your ability to understand the student, to identify what are the most important things that this student needs to work on. Now, the way that I would do this, and I have a really specific formula, and the reason I've done this is having a look at some research, but also having conversations with students and finding a way that, that we can provide feedback in a timely fashion. So I'm a big believer in limiting the amount of time that I have so that I prioritize carefully. And saving as much time as I can. This is about student benefit, not about effort put in. If the student doesn't change what they do, doesn't matter if you spend 3 hours providing feedback, it was pointless. So the first thing, I loved, enjoyed, got a lot out of, was impressed. These are intentionally emotive language. This is how you're starting it. Identify something that they have done well. Now, I would put the caveat on that every now and again we find a paper that we just look at and go, oh my goodness, they didn't even spell their name right. I am not a big believer in lying to students. I do think you need to have a hard look at yourself if you can't find something that the student has done that you do like, that you do appreciate. But yeah, if you can find absolutely nothing and you're being honest, then you're better off to not include it. Don't lie to them. So you want to identify something that was really strong. Remember that if I was to come to you and say, geez, I love the way that you teach, and I have a suspicion that if you did this, it would make it even better, that's going to be a lot easier for you to handle than for me just to come in and say, I have a suspicion that if you did this, you'd be better. Because what you're assuming is when I say better, I'm actually saying from bad to good. Okay? So identify the thing that's really strong. This won't be anything new to any of you. Now, the next sentence is actually really important, and I include the next sentence verbatim. And basically what it says is, in order to continue, and continue is the most important word, continue to improve your writing, I've included a couple of suggestions below. Okay? Now, the word continue tells the student that I think that they've already improved. So it assumes that they've been working hard, and it affirms the student to say, look, this is a process and everybody's going through this process. So it's really, really important to acknowledge that this feedback is not me saying it's bad and it needs to be good. It's about, okay, this is another step along the path. The other part of that is I've included a couple of suggestions below. Now this is purely a time-saving device. The reason I've said that is because then later on, as I'll explain in a minute, you can drop and you can cut and paste specific feedback that will apply into their next assessment without writing it every time. So you can just drop little dot points. Which brings me to the next point. Your job as a marker, as someone who has read hundreds and hundreds of assessments, is to think really, really carefully about exactly what this student should work on next. Remember that skills sit on top of skills, and you need to build up that foundation first before you get to the fine details of colons and semicolons, of, perfect grammar. So think about where this student is at. What's the thing that's going to have the most power for them in improving their writing? Now identify only 2 to 3. You do not need to list everything, and you should not list everything, because they will not implement it and you will just frighten them and make them feel like they're not doing anything very well. If you can get your students to change 2 or 3 things about the way that they're writing, you've done amazingly well. You will have amazing outcomes. So identify 2 to 3 things, and in the first 10 to 15 assessments that you mark, copy and paste those into a Word document. Make sure that you have only 1 item per little statement, and then after a while you'll find that you only need about 10 different comments. And then you're just choosing which of those are most relevant. So for first year students, it's going to be things about structure, it's going to be things about grammar and spelling, the really kind of basic things, but later on it'll be things about, okay, critical thinking and providing an example. Okay, so you write a single statement about each of the ideas. The other suggestion I would make is remember that it's forward focusing. So if you're saying, look, you need to work on your grammatical structure, then you might provide a suggestion that says, okay, what I did, so relate it back to your own journey, What I did when I was dealing with this is I would make a point of learning one grammatical rule per week, or make a point of reading my work out loud. Whatever the suggestion is, make a suggestion that will enable the student to achieve what you're setting out to achieve. Now, you can't always do that, but often if you bring in a personal anecdote, you're providing the student a useful hint, but you're also providing them with an indicator that you are just a normal student. And this reduces the power distance between you and the student and increases the likelihood that they're going to engage with this material. So you only want to identify 2 to 3. By the time you've marked 10 to 15 assignments, you should have all of these comments in a bank, and you can just drop them in. You need to use your critical thinking skills and your understanding of students and writing to choose which are the most important, and that's really, really important. There's no point giving high-level tasks if they haven't got the foundations right. But then you include 2, maximum of 3 things in there. And then finish up with some kind of final word of support and your name. And the reason I say your name is because I think it's good to have a bit of transparency with regards to the marker. You may have different policies in your department as to whether you're disclosing the name, but personally I think if you're prepared to provide feedback to a student, you should be prepared to be letting them know who provided it. So it might be, nice work, really looking forward to seeing your next assessment, forward focused things, well done, you should be pleased, I hope this is useful, that kind of thing, really personal. Now, that's all well and good. But what if you can't get them to read it in the first place, which is an issue? So many students don't even open their feedback. Now, the approach that I would use to this requires a face-to-face class, but what I would be doing, and have done in many instances, is after the feedback has been provided, the activity is for the students to open their feedback. Most of the time, this feedback is provided in some kind of digital form. They all have, the vast majority of them have phones or tablets. Get them to open that feedback and do a pair and share activity. It doesn't have to take long, 10 minutes, and get them to answer the following questions. What was the most valuable piece of feedback that's going to improve your writing? So they can tell this to one another, okay? They don't have to tell it to the tutor. What was the most valuable piece of feedback? So you're already getting them to kind of prioritize and focus on what they can do in the future. What was the most confusing piece of feedback? Whether you like it or not, some of your markers will write things, some of you will write things that are confusing. And so getting them to identify those confusing things, the tutor can actually provide clarification in class, other students can provide clarification. It might also serve as a useful tool to identify if there's something that's kind of feedback that's coming through again and again that students are finding confusing, that perhaps we can change the way that we provide that feedback. And then the final and the most important, what's your plan? How are you going to change this? So yep, you've identified that grammar is your problem. What are you going to do about it? Now, we know that goals are really useful in terms of changing future behavior of student, of anybody, but when you put a plan around that goal, the strength of that increases. So if you're getting your students to identify the best, most valuable feedback, seek clarification on the confusing feedback, and create a goal, you've gotten them to engage with the feedback in a way that they generally won't be. And you've done it in a really safe and collaborative space and provided them support to do that. So with those principles in mind, I've provided, there's a fact sheet available that you can get, and those details. Give it a go, and then ask your students how they found it. Okay, the most important thing to remember is you are trying to change what students do, not necessarily what students know. They can do the knowing bit elsewhere, but you actually need to change the way that they engage with the process. That's incredibly important. I hope this is useful. I look forward to hearing back from you and hearing all sorts of great reports about your students engaging in their feedback and improving their writing and critical thinking skills. Thanks. Bye.